Crazy. Okay, been thinking a lot about the knowledge of good and evil recently. It's like, what is the problem underneath all problems with the world? And a lot of people might say, well, the problem underneath all problems of the world is that, we don't have enough technology, or it's cancer, or it's greed, or maybe it's something in the mind, or maybe it's death, maybe the fact that we die, or maybe it's something even more fundamental like entropy at the high system level that causes all of these problems. And I would agree those are all problems, but I don't think they're the fountainhead of all problems. And for the following reasons. What's unique about people who die is they don't actually experience nothing. They go to a place that they describe as more alive. They they describe like once they die, they go through this tunnel of light and they go to a reality that's like waking up from the dream. And they encounter, God. And they have to decide whether they come back or not. And they know that while they're coming back, nobody's going to believe them, so they'll observe something in their environment and they'll as evidence, like a shoe on the roof of the hospital. And so when they're resuscitated, they'll say, hey, there's a shoe on the roof of the hospital. I saw this when I was dead, thereby proving that they shouldn't have been able to observe that, but in fact, they had, and they had knowledge of it when their brain was inactive. That's called veridical perception. But one of the coolest things about what people report when they're in these near-death experiences, or I just call it a post-death experience because they're pronounced clinically dead, is when they're in this reality to describe that their understanding is instant. There is no suffering, there is no torment. The physical constants are even different. Where light doesn't travel, light emanates. But I think that instant understanding, when they communicate with an entity there, it's instant. There is no encoding, transmission, reception, decoding, interpretation. And it begs the question, why? If that reality does exist, why are we separate from it? Why would we be separate? And the only coherent explanation that I've found is in the Bible, in the story of Genesis, where Adam and Eve bit a fruit called the forbidden fruit, the knowledge of good and evil, and it did something to them. But in order to understand the significance of why that could have been the cause of all of the atrocities of humanity today, and why we have death camps and genocide and poison experiments and torture technology, is we have to understand, we first need to make the claim and make it self-evident that there is an entity outside of us that exists that's extremely powerful. And my first premise is this: in order for something to exist, it must be processed. Nothing can exist in reality that is not processed. Which means this water bottle right here, the water moving around on the inside, the way those molecules are perfectly balancing and all the electrons that are moving through my muscles and the signals coming down from my brain, all that is being processed by something because it exists and it works flawlessly. But I'm not the one who's processing it. In fact, I don't even have complete knowledge of how that process works. So in order for reality to function, it must be registered and processed by something that has complete knowledge of it. And I think it makes sense then if, as we can all conclude, that reality functions, there aren't a lot of glitches. I mean, there's patterns, there's order, there's processes that happen that we don't know how they all together work, but they work flawlessly. In order for that to theoretically actually work, there would have to be a perspective that is omnipotent and omnipresent in order to run it and to process it completely in the background. And I think that perspective, That processor is the foundation of reality. And so in the garden, back to Genesis, we know that as God. That processor, that intelligence, that perspective, we had a relationship with. And we were in a state similar to what near-death experiencers describe, where we had instant understanding. We were innocent. There was no suffering. But then we were tempted by the serpent, and we'll get decoding this language later, but there was a serpent. And the serpent, God said, do not eat from this fruit, or in the day that you do, you shall surely die. The serpent approaches Adam and Eve and says, no, you won't die. You surely won't die. God doesn't want you to eat that because you'll become like God. And so you could tell that Eve in that moment is her conscience activates, and she's trying to think, well, the fruit looks good. I want to be wise. Maybe I'll take a bite. And as soon as she took a bite, instantly, the state space of their awareness of what they could perceive expanded immediately. Because it says right after that they realized they were naked, which is very just obscure to recognize that you were naked for the first time, as if that was something bad. God comes, and he's like, where are you guys? And they were hiding. They thought it would be right to hide from a being that already knew where they were, further making self-evident this new illusion and almost what we might call a mutation of their thinking, where they thought that it was right to hide. God finds them. They get kicked out of the garden. And so before we get into the fall, I think this pattern of serpent, forbidden fruit, eats, change in state space is exactly the pattern of a virus. You have a virus. That virus has a payload. And what the virus does is it deceives a cell. It tricks its membrane into thinking that it's something useful. Once it tricks the cell, it deceives it, it gets past the membrane, it injects its payload into the middle layer of the cell. Now, it's not trying to corrupt all the genome, and it's not trying to corrupt the proteins. It's trying to inject in the middle layer to mediate between both of those things so that it gains as much control as possible. It has as much causal power as possible, but without exposing itself too much. And so in the garden, I think it's probable to think of the virus as the serpent, and the deception as the reasoning, the righteous reasoning that the serpent utilized to trick Eve's conscience into giving the fruit access, which was the payload of the virus. Once that fruit got access, it injected itself into her belief system, or who knows what that, where or what precisely it corrupted. It caused a mutation of some sort in the way they perceive reality, the way they understand morality. But I think it gave them a belief. I think the belief is what was corrupted. That they could, the belief that I could know what is good and bad. That's an illusion. Me as a limited entity in linear time with a very small context window because of Miller's law, which states that the short-term memory of our brain can only remember, 7 or 8 things at once. I think I can know what is right or wrong as it relates to the fundamental purpose, direction, and eschatological endpoint of reality. That's a mutation. That's an illusion. And it's the same pattern that we see with cancer. When a cell, it starts with a mutation. There's a mutation in its genome. And a cell it doesn't literally think, but metaphorically, it thinks that it is better off to live without the body, to build my own little organ or tumor by siphoning the resources from the body. It thinks from its perspective. It doesn't know that it is inside of a host with consciousness. It doesn't know this objective reality exists. My cells in my body right now don't know that I'm talking. They don't know what is being communicated. They're just triggering little muscle cells. I mean, they are part of something so much bigger than themselves. And that's why I think of theology as like a cell trying to study the body. But it is us trying to study God. But not to get off track. That is the same pattern where the cancer is under the guise that it thinks this is the optimal path. It is under the illusion that I should make a tumor, that I should not go through apotheosis. That is the same viral mutation pattern that humans operate from when they make truth claims without basis or orientation or coherence to the fundamental processor of reality, to God, to the perspective that is oriented on the outside, that could only know what is true. Gödel's incompleteness theorem states, no system can understand itself completely from within itself. It takes a perspective on the outside to see the complete image. It's why we trust satellite imagery more than a ground observation. And so as soon as that belief was integrated into their mind, into the architecture of their cognition, well, let's go through the story. They leave the garden, and I want to pause that there because I think God kicked us out of the garden not because he was mad or to punish us, but because of mercy. What I mean by this is, he says, man, he has become like one of us. We shall now let him reach out and bite the fruit of eternal life. Because if we would have, after we had this mutation, after we contracted this virus, if we had reached out our hand and bitten the fruit of everlasting life, we would have been incurable. We would have been damned. There would have been no way for us to overcome this virus. And so when God implements death, I see that as the same pattern that an immunologist would take when trying to inoculate a cell against a vaccine. So you take a vaccine is made up of a weakened version of a virus. It's either dead, or the immunologist will alter the global conditions as to reduce the virulence of the virus, giving the cells the ability to adapt immunity to it without dying too quickly or it being too potent. So as soon as God kicks us out of the garden, he implements death. I see that as a mechanism to reduce the expression of this virus. Because think about it. What kind of atrocities would we justify under the guise of faulty morality on man? What kind of torture technology would we come up with if we didn't die? What would we do to each other if there was no limit on pain? These things are hard to wrap our mind around. But I think it would be something akin to what I think it's Zeus did to Prometheus, where the way he punished Prometheus is he had a crow peck away his liver during the day, and his liver would regenerate at night for eternity. That's different. that's a different kind of game. And so God, he already had, it seems like, a vaccination plan, because it also says in the Bible that from the beginning, I need to pull the specific verse, but from the beginning, God had already planned to redeem the world. And so we are in this reality. We have 70 to 80 years to live, and we're adapting immunity. The only way for us to adapt immunity is we have to integrate the correct template. We have to integrate the cure. And the cure, just like if a doctor or again an immunologist is going to cure a body, and think about a civilization as a body. Think of it as a collective organism. He doesn't try, like if God was trying to cure us, he couldn't just, let's put it in our context. We can't just cure the body by showing it a video of what is right and what is wrong, what a good pathogen is and what is a bad pathogen is, because it's ontologically just incoherent. Like, the cells can't learn from what comes in through my eyes and what's processed by the brain. The cure has to be in their native language. It has to be injected. And so if we start to think about Jesus Christ and the Immaculate Conception, think about how the Immaculate Conception, and what would the perspective to a cell be like of a syringe being injected. I don't know, you're like, you don't know what a syringe is, you don't know where these cells came from, you don't know how they got there, you don't know that an entity, that you can't even know exists, is injecting this thing into an arm, and you don't even know what an arm is. That level of abstraction is the same level of abstraction that we experience when we try to understand the Immaculate Conception and who Jesus really was. And I think it's ironic that humanity, a large part, I think 17% of the world believes in Jesus and follows his teachings. I would say maybe less than 1% actually follow them. I would say 90% of Christianity is nominalism and cultural, and so they're not focusing on the source that actually produces the fruits they enjoy. A cultural Christian to me is like somebody who reaps the harvest of another man's planting. But it's interesting that if Jesus was the cure, and if this was the payload from a super intelligent entity that's responsible for the Big Bang to retrain humanity and redeem us to be re-injected into an elevated state of immortality, some would reject him. Just like a transplant. When you get a transplant, your immune system rejects, or it can, and sometimes and oftentimes does, that's why a suppressant is necessary, rejects the transplant. It rejects the very thing that's trying to save it. And I think we see that today. Anyways, thank you for watching.